All right, so I'm recording. Yeah, so thanks for taking this call. Thanks for putting up with on my not doing the best practice of setting up meetings. I was late on Friday and I was too excited, but that's not an excuse. So the process is I'm supposed to send you an agenda doc, attach and everything into that, so which I have done. And thanks for doing some of the work there. So what I wanted to talk about is engineering process at GitLab, but maybe I'll just have some of the background. Is that I'm a product manager working on BSM, and so at GitLab, so you've been here what, like, over, is it half a year now? It seems you've been 2 months, only 2 months.
Here 2 months.
Oh wow, okay, so
Yeah, January
I,
22nd was my start date.
oh, this year, okay. So I grossly overestimate people being here longer usually because we just a GitLab goes by so quickly. So maybe I shouldn't be such a workaholic and just offer just a couple of words of like, or offer you a time to ask questions if you have any of myself of product management in general.
No, I have a pretty good idea who you are, Victor.
Okay.
Um, I don't know if I have specific questions. I'm trying to make sure I understand, and you just will need to be patient with me because not all my terminology is quite crisp yet.
Okay.
From that perspective, so.
Not a problem. So yeah, I'll try. I try to not assume too many things. So what we do in product is at GitLab is obviously we develop GitLab the product, and since GitLab by now you definitely know we try to use as much of it as possible. We put a premium on that, often going out of our way to use really half-baked features and really try to say no to external tools because we put such a bias on that, believing that that will help us improve the product or make us feel pain, dog fooding 101. And so a big part of that, or my job in particular, I tell people it's doubly hard because almost everybody uses the features of the plan stage, of which I'm in the product manager of. So I get a lot of feedback. And in particular, I think an area that has been hotly debated. So I'm sure that as you coming in, and you can maybe tell me, how your role is defined and so forth. But I think this will all be related to, so I'll stop after this and let you talk. So one context is we didn't have a lot of engineering process in the past, and we just didn't even have the role of engineering manager as a title, even when we had leads as well. And then I think it was at that point that was the philosophy. I remember many times saying like, people should self-manage or something like that, and saying specifically that. And then and so obviously I think we've gone a lot way from that from beyond that philosophy, and we have engineering managers, and I don't think technically we have team leads, or maybe that's part of the career path thingy, but you can let me know about that later. But we have engineering managers, and we have middle management, we have director levels, and we have folks like yourself, and then we have Eric Johnson. And Eric Johnson, to me, was the one who really kickstarted this once we hired him, and really built out this philosophy and the teams, which I really like. And then on the product management side, I've been really pushing to have engineering department do engineering management, and have product management do less and less, and maybe ideally zero project management, because when we were in the team lead world, that a lot of product managers have been doing that. And so even with new product folks coming in, unfortunately, in my opinion, a lot of that culture has stayed. And so a lot of disconnect I personally see is product wants to do this. We think we have all these great ideas in terms of process and project management. Engineering has all these ideas, and they're doing these things, and they're creating all these process and metrics, and we're not coming together. So broadly, I see a room for improvement across departments. Another piece of background I want to offer you is what Mech and the quality team have been doing. So what I've observed with Eric bringing Mech in is that very early on, the quality team was, and they continue to be, tasked with formalizing a lot of the process in terms of just writing in the handbook, but also making the tools inside GitLab. So an obvious one is GitLab Triage Bot, and then the Insights project, which is now being moved into GitLab. So that team has been involved heavily with defining the process, making sure it's instituted inside the product and driven and going forward. So there's a lot of background there. And since I have a really bad cough, I'm going to let you respond to any of that before I talk about like why am I even coming to you.
Yeah, you said a couple things that are kind of interesting, which is and this has always been a thorny issue between product management and development or software development, which is who runs the projects. And what we've done this year is we've kind of so first of all, to my knowledge, we don't have really concept of tech lead. We have senior engineers and we have managers. You could argue that engineering managers could be considered a tech lead. Usually you use tech lead when you have engineering managers who need to scale above a smaller size. But if you look at most of our teams, our goal is this year is to basically effectively have teams between, I would say, 4 and 6 reporting to a single manager. Some teams need maybe a little larger, some teams maybe a little smaller.
And then that's still back end, front end separate as sort of the default case.
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And what I think is going to be true is that project management for a given area is going to be, if it's contained, if the effort associated with a particular activity is contained within that area, it's going to be very straightforward. And that's usually where, the engineering managers can self-control it and they can contain it and effectively do it. I think where it becomes really hard is when we start implementing features which require some type of cross team, not front end, back end, but cross team in the sense of going between, say, plan, create, and verify as an example, right? So like that's where we're going to have to kind of look at the organization as a whole and see how we do there, because like that's usually honestly where most projects get gummed up is because coordinating between this team over here that's doing some work and this team over here that's doing some work, and oh, by the way, their priorities are not necessarily aligned, can become really problematic, right? So like that's generally when you see that kind of behavior, or you see fits and starts on a given effort, where even MVC, if you can keep MVC within a team and then make the MVC move between teams, all the better. But that's not always the case. That's at a high level, Victor, that's probably what I get out of the conversation just a second ago.
Okay.
I agree. We're organizing, we're getting one-to-one relationships. So in theory, project management should be better shared and better handled.
Okay.
Where it's gonna get tricky, I think, is in the category of, one, does the product manager exist and when do they get hired on relative to the one-to-one relationship? And then the other aspect.
Right. Yeah.
As soon as you have a feature which goes across, is cross-cutting, that's where it's going to get really interesting.
Yeah. That's interesting. I've been just this weekend, I've been putting together some issues and talking to plan folks, because I know we're getting plan product managers, and so selfishly, I don't want a PM. Selfishly for me as a plan PM and for the new PM, I don't want PMs having to not have a dedicated team, because I think that's always really difficult for PM, and even for a new PM to say like, you have all these great ideas, but you can't really execute on them because you have to wait on this other PM. So I've been selfishly wanting to have teams split already within plan. But anyways, so that's great. So an area that the plan side of the product is working on, which I'm working on, is inventing really the future of agile DevOps. And so that's a very bold, obviously, a statement, but more specifically in terms of an area that I'm focused on is figuring out how to do workflows, how to characterize metrics, how to help teams ship faster, and so on and so forth. Again, that's not specific enough. But for example, we have one product category called value stream management, and it's something I'm sure you've heard of, sort of a buzzword type thing that I would say. And within this framework of value stream management, of which we participated in a Gartner report last year, and we scored actually pretty high, but we haven't really made additional headway, and that's something that we want to do. And so the way we think of value stream management somewhat closely is associated with what the industry thinks about it, or what these analyst reports. And I just wanted to talk about that and see if that aligns with what you're thinking, because where I'm stuck is there's this framework out there. I don't know if I'm 100% on board with it. I don't want to just build a feature into GitLab because that's what these analyst reports say. and I want to check in with our customers, which I've done, but when checking in with GitLab, I can go a little bit more detailed than say another customer. And so how this framework is, or what it emphasizes, is that there's this connotation of having workflow stages, right? In dev, in review, in UAT, in production, check, monitoring, so on. So you have the workflow, and first of all, like right away, like does GitLab even really use a workflow? So that's already one red flag. And so once you have this workflow, according to VSM, you can know how long each stage is taking. And so the name of the game in VSM is really making the entire end-to-end stage as small as possible, because VSM and I and the industry agrees that if we compress the end-to-end cycle time, it's of direct business benefit, because Agile teaches us the faster you ship, the more deploys you have, and then all these criteria, then you're going to have better business outcomes. So you can sort of draw a logic to that. It's it's pretty obvious, I would say. It's not exactly scientific, but I've seen some work in the industry where they correlate high performing teams with like 3 or 4 things, and one of them is which is unsurprising, just like high morale and low burnout, which is sort of weird, but they characterize that, which is really cool. Another one is high frequency of deploys, which is, again, so that people are not annoyed, so in the infrastructure there. And then the other one is a short cycle times. So what I really want to focus on is the short cycle times, especially in the case of GitLab, because our frequency of deploys, you can argue, is constant-ish. Morale, we can sort of, how do you build that into the product? So I don't want to tackle that just yet. So I really want to focus on short cycle times. And this is where I'm sort of hitting a wall, because at GitLab, it's not actually a really metric that a lot of people talk about. And it's actually not something that we're officially optimizing for in a handbook, because we say something about velocity over predictability, which I'm not 100% on board with, but if that's a handbook, I'm going to roll with that. And so the handbook seems to be saying things like high number of merge requests. It's saying like 10 merge requests per developer. I think is a good thing. And then he wants people to game it, because then people will actually make smaller merge requests. I actually agree with that. So I think that's a really, really great incentive. So there's that where at GitLab we're saying more merge requests, because we sort of have a fixed rate. And we don't really use these workflow stages any ways, because we have technically we have 2 labels called in dev and in review, and some teams use them, and I think Plan uses them sporadically. But it's not like we have in review, in UAT, in QA. We don't have that. And so even if we were to invent all these tools, would we even care about those stage times and those things? So I'm like, should we really build this? What's going on? So I'm sort of really cautious about that right now. And so when I'm coming to you, I'm not only asking you, should we build that? I'm asking you more broadly, of course, comment on that, but maybe from your perspective, from your experience, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what's your vision of GitLab in terms of just engineering excellence? And that's why I was trying to stay broad and not like force you into a conversation where to get your great ideas more broadly about how you think we should scale, how we should do engineering, and hopefully we can take all that feedback and inform Victor on maybe the next step. But yeah, I wanted to purposely paint a really broad picture and invite you to pick and choose whatever area that you want to talk about.
Okay. Yeah. So let's back up here and kind of start at the high level, and then I can kind of get into maybe specifics here in a few minutes. So when I think about value stream, what I actually think about is I don't think about cycle time. What I think about is how fast is it from when something is produced to when customer adoption is, right? So like what's the real value is not in just pushing out features. The real value is in customers actually using the features, right? So the question I would have is if we're going to talk about cycle time, let's be very specific about that as opposed to value
the definition.
Stream. So if you said to me that value stream is about cycle time, I'll just have to change my mental model. But like when I was looking at this originally, I said, well, really, is this more about adoption, or is this more about, how fast we can get a feature out the door? it's really tricky because we're in theory building a general purpose system where people can create their own workflows associated with things, and because of that, it's you know, you have this model of, you can either be extremely generic where you look at the stages that we have and you could measure the time between the stages, and then that's how you could actually follow things through, or you know, you have to be able to allow people to quickly determine what their workflow is and then kind of what the time is spent. When I've worked with teams, and I've worked on teams where, what's the right way to put this? I've worked on teams where everybody is doing their own workflow, if that makes sense. So like as an example, you know, they all define their workflow, but it's different between teams.
You mean across teams or even within a team? No,
cross teams. So you know, team has a workflow that they're working. Another team has a different workflow. Another team has a different workflow. And some of it's, you know, this is going to sound crazy, but some of it's, you know, even to the point of what's in code review versus just saying, you know, here's a whole bunch of stuff and then it goes to done, right? You know, what's in code review versus what's in test versus, you know, that aspect of it. And some of this actually may be dictated by the business, right? So like if you were in the health industry, like right. I'm guessing that they have a lot more test cycles associated with things. So that leads me to a more general solution, which is, you know, what you have to do is for a given either a merge request or issue, every activity on it is considered an event. And then you just got to start trying to figure out which events are important and relevant for your workflow to then go look at it and analyze it. So like as an example, one thing that we've seen with our metrics that we've been looking at the past couple of months is our merge requests in the past 6 months have gone up as far as the 85th percentile. So if you look at the average hasn't gone up a lot, but 85th percentile is like gone up from like.
What do you mean gone up? The number of merge requests or the time?
Time to merge. So this is from when the merge request was created to when it was merged at. So like those times. And like if you look at those times between those, what you'll see is us go from under 10 days, I think it was like 6 or 8 or something like that, to over 14. And like, you know, like, look, we're talking about 2 weeks, right? So like, and that doesn't sound like a lot. You know, you say, well, Christopher, it's the 85th percentile, so that means 15%. Well, 15%, you know, when you're doing 1,200 merge requests a month is
that's too high.
it's you know, it's 120 of these, right? So like 120 of these are sitting around. So then the question becomes is, what are we doing? You know, what's causing that? Is it because you know, code reviews? Is it because, you know, our testing infrastructure is really broken where like a lot of build, and that's generally what happens is that most organizations, what they'll do is they'll say, okay, what's really slowing us down? And what generally we try to do is as developers, we say, well, we'll go just ask the developers. And that is a option, but it's not the preferred option. The reason why it's not the preferred option is because, I hate to say it this way, and I'm guilty of this as well. You talk to a developer or a software engineer about what the problem is that's slowing them down. They will pick on whatever pet peeve issue that is that drives them crazy. You know, like our code reviews are too stringent around our style coding. You know, which meanwhile, like the builds are failing 50% of the time, and that's really what's slowing things down, right? You know, it's like, you know, those are the kinds of things that you have to really look at the data, especially when you're talking about programming, you know, in an organization of, or say 20 people, and say, okay, what's really slowing things down, and then how do we basically effectively, you know, push it from a perspective of, you know, how do we adjust? What projects do we put in place? So when I look at this, if we're talking about cycle time, that's kind of like, I'd love to say, okay, we're going to make a workflow. Everybody's going to use that workflow, but I've seen too many groups. Like even if you give 4 teams the option of, okay, create your workflow, they'll come up with 4 different workflows. It's just the nature of people, I guess, is maybe the right way to put it. And you know, you can force that as an organization, but then, you know, the perception is that you're putting too much rigidity in the system, right? From that perspective. So, the other thing to note here is that you were talking about velocity over predictability. So estimation, I think if you ask around, I think what you'll get as feedback is that the main reason why we chose velocity over predictability is because we didn't want to have to estimate. Why don't we want to estimate? Because estimation's hard, it takes a lot of time, and it's problematic. And more importantly, we don't have data that helps us with that estimation at this point. If we put the right things in place to actually start measuring this stuff, we may actually find we may actually find a way to do that without having to maybe be as laborious as people think it is. Ironically enough, we put that in our document, and then a lot of engineering managers are still doing some level of estimation themes, right? So like there's a little bit of give and take here that's happening associated with it. So that leads to the other point which I want to make, which is, we're talking about cycle time. We're making things smaller, but the other thing to look at with VSM is complexity of change, right? So like as we go through, in theory, they're supposed to get smaller. Are they actually getting smaller, or are they actually getting bigger? What's the story there, right? And how does it work? And that will lead us to additional information. So I'm not sure how best to metrify that, other than to say, like number of lines of change. But like that's an example of those are the kinds of things that I would expect that, a rich system to have, where I can basically pull that in. Again, it's all event driven, and then it's just data that then you can cross reference to basically present, the information, which is kind of more of a generic, think of it as what do you call it? I want to say TSD, but basically the metric information over a period of time,
right?
And just dumped into the database. And think of it as much like we do with our other API statistics and those kinds of things, where we basically provide that information. It's the same model. It's just the numbers are probably smaller, just from perspective of the samples you get. Does that help, or is that?
It does. It does.
Okay. By the way, it's extremely relevant. If you want a team to move fast, this is the type of information that like if you want a team to move fast, and you want, like, the number one question that I ask people in my interviews is how do you know a team is performing well?
Right.
I get the answer of, well, everybody's kind of happy, we meet all our objectives, and I don't have any escalations. Like, to me, that's like great. You're probably a great manager, but you're not pushing the team, right? You're not thinking about it in terms of, okay, like what really is effective here, right?
Right. So that's interesting with the events. So basically, I have two broad feature areas that I want to move forward with, and wanted to get your take on them. And then so the first one is what is sort of been assumed, which to me is not that exciting, and I think we have to build, but is the one that I'm worried about, which is we have the concept of a workflow, and then you show the stage times, and then you show also the end-to-end time. And so you can say, if we were to have QA be a stage, and then you can see QA is the bottleneck, then you would focus on that. So that's sort of the really obvious one, which I don't like precisely because of the things you were saying, because of so many caveats. But it's almost like we're almost forced to build that because there is some value and there's a good story, and then there will be some customers. So I almost want to not do that right now. With the event one, which is really interesting, is I precisely was thinking about events last week. So it's great that I didn't bring it up, and then you talked about it too. So that's like a checkbox. It's something that verifies that I'm not crazy, which is when I see the plan team or any other team at GitLab, they're not using workflows like in these stages, and things are just being merged. So there are stages, or there are perhaps goalpost events that just happen, which is issue is open, maybe issue gets assigned to somebody, issue is merged, and then it's eventually deployed. And then for us at GitLab, it's deployed to it's merged. It's a branch. The .0 release branch is an event as well, and then there's maybe like RCs, and those are events as well. But there's other interesting events that I think you were talking about, which is, as a business stakeholder, Victor, I will go into the issue and or merge request and participate. Am I doing a lot of that at the beginning, during the process, toward the end? As a QA stakeholder, same. As a security stakeholder, you mentioned like health industry. There's going to be a lot of compliance stakeholders along the way. And so GitLab we can actually track those events relatively easily, whether it's going to be a signee, whether it's going to be label, or just the simple fact that Victor just had some comments, early on and later on. And then so my feature concept is you essentially get some level of statistics and do a correlation. And it could be very easy as a first pass, or it could be very sexy as like have like a in-time scatter plot of like all the times that Victor has participated in the issue, and then maybe average that. But it could be something very simple, like on the average, your business stakeholder, what you care about, because you're configuring it, this is the PM, they participate often at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, and then you correlate that with something else, maybe like the merge, the time to merge, or maybe some other metric, and you surface that to a team, and then they take that away, and they can action on that. So I'm seeing a lot of nodding. So is that the type of feature that you think a team would use at GitLab, or?
That is definitely the type of feature that would cause a team to evaluate, what's going on in a given situation. The question would be is do you have the high level metrics that point them in a certain direction? Because there's just so much information that it's kind of hard to, so that's why when you said originally, the staging timing actually is interesting in regards to the fact of, if you're in a continuous deployment, now this is where some data is going to matter and some isn't. So like as an example, we have a release date, and if you look at our process, I haven't gone and have the data to back this up, but if you go look at our process, my guess is that time to release is going to be very fixed in regards to the fact that most people are driving towards code freeze, and then releases 2 weeks later. So consequently, you're going to see this delta that's not going to be that interesting, and you can't really change that. So like from when feature is conceptually decided to when, or not conceptually, but when features actually started to be engaged on working on to release is going to be somewhat within a certain boundaries, just because of the not arbitrariness, but the deltas we already have built into the system.
Sure.
Continuous delivery system, completely different story. Like that's where you would be in a situation where, like, in theory, when I hit the merge request merge, there's some amount of machinery that's happening, and I may want to optimize for that, right? So like that's probably the best example of your workflow processes may in fact cause you to make decisions about certain areas. But just the fact that you have people looking at it and being able to talk about it is key, because again, when I talk about managers and whether or not I think they're doing well or not, one of the questions I ask in the back of my head is can you kind of predict how your team's going to do next month? And if the answer is well, we'll just have to wait and see what feature requests we get. That's not necessarily thinking about it in the same way that right from their perspective. So I think that resonates, and I think the event idea is the right way to go, because it's going to have to be somewhat generic, just because
the generic part. That was one of my struggles as a designer of the product. Like, you've seen cycle analytics by now, maybe you've seen conversational development, or maybe you haven't seen it because we don't really use it, and that's why they're not great features of GitLab. And the problem there is the non-customizability, or the non-generalization of it. I think I invented a word. But if we were to introduce stages, that's customizable, but then it's really hard to use, because you have to have compliance of people moving issues into the stage, and then that has to be perfect. Or you have to have awesome automation so that they go into the stages, or you have to assume that the stages are non-overlapping, which again, that's not realistic when I see it, because yes, and in these teams inside GitLab and outside GitLab, an issue goes into QA and then goes into code review. Technically, they're in a stage, but realistically, that's not how people work, because they're in the QA, but then they're looking at some QA, or a business user jumps in and says like, oh, I just used it because I went into your QA environment and had some feedback. But with the event model, you just document the fact that the business owner went into the QA environment and had a comment and left some feedback, and that's an event that you can track and index on later, and from a statistical point of view. So I think that's very powerful. And to me, that's a lot more generic tracking events, because it's a role, and they're taking an action in the system, and that's easily captured, and you can surface that, and that can be, you can surface that information. So to me, that's why I'm really liking the event.
Yeah, the tricky part is then you have to figure out how to build out the system such that that information is queryable without like becoming too general purpose, right? Where it's like recreating SQL for a relational database.
Sure.
The other thing that I think is important to note here is we've been talking about this more generically. You're going to have tiers of this, and this is probably where I have some strong opinions. I don't know if I've necessarily validated them, but it's just been what my experience has been. So an MR, when you create an MR, it should be drive to merge as quickly as possible. So it's pretty easy to measure from creation to finish
Right.
what's going on. If you have and you can even find abandoned MRs where you say, okay, like this got abandoned. So then therefore, like you measure that to see, like is the team being ineffective in some way.
Sure.
Issues. We've got lots of great ideas.
Yes, that's an unsolved problem. Yeah.
So we gotta measure from when it actually starts getting worked on, as opposed to just, somebody created an issue. Because like that delta is so huge relative. Like if I look at
right, there's yeah.
Right. So like our work relative to that issue is so far behind that it's
right. Well, I'll comment for 30 more seconds and then let you have the last word, because I do have to jump in a minute. But that comes back, loops all the way back to your very first point, which is like where you asked me like VSM Victor, what does that mean? Like cycle time and stuff like that. So one of our product marketing managers, John Jeremiah, has been constantly reminding me what VSM should be about. Is he didn't focus on delivering to the customer, but I'm sure that's in his brain. But he's focusing on when the customer requested it, there's some additional time there before the team actually actions on it. But there's so much gray there, because whether you're in a consulting industry, whether you're in a custom development or GitLab, where we just have crazy ideas all the time. So like, how do you quantify that? How do you capture that? Does it matter? So from a product perspective, I just want to like ignore that for now. And like our MVC is just to focus on engineering excellence, because that's well defined, and from a features perspective that you can define that pretty well, because you agreed to do it, and it's a sprint that started. We'll take that start, and maybe deploy, maybe even merge is good enough as a first MVC. So but I didn't really think about going to the customer, so that's a great reminder for me, like customer adoption. And you can definitely build that into GitLab with our monitoring and all those things. And so that's another great feature we can build on later as well.
Okay, cool. So, good conversation. You got to go. Do we have next steps, or is this like a continuing conversation?
This is a continuing conversation. This is super helpful for myself, because I really owe like the team, all of GitLab, essentially, a clear vision for VSM, which we have one. I don't like it. I'm just really annoyed at myself. So this conversation is super helpful for me. So right now I'm leaning towards, we have like two big feature areas. One is event driven. So the next step is for me to really carve out some specifics, and then throw that one specifically at yourself and the entire engineering department, so they can say, we love this idea, we would totally use it. And then we would just go from there. So that's the next step.
Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, let's keep continuing the conversation. I should probably share some of the metrics information that we're doing on Insights, the next one as well, if you're not aware of those. Because
a little bit, but we can.
It's good context, at least around at least Christopher's thought process from that perspective. So
excellent.
Cool.
Excellent. I'll get this on YouTube. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thanks. All right. Talk to you later. Bye.